"I'm your wife now," said the giant woman he inherited from his dying brother. The words struck him harder than the winter wind that howled outside the cabin walls. "I'm your wife now," she said, her voice deep but trembling, her broad frame filling the doorway as if the timbers themselves bowed to her presence. She wasn't cruel in her tone, only certain, as though this had been written down long before either of them had a choice. His dying brother's last request had been simple in words, impossible in weight: take care of her. "She's yours now." He looked at her, taller than him by a head, strong enough to carry a sack of grain as if it were nothing, yet her hands twisted nervously in her apron. She wasn't asking out of love, not yet, but out of duty, out of fear of being cast adrift with no place to belong. He could see the loneliness in her eyes, and beneath it, the fragile hope that she wouldn't be turned away. He swallowed hard, feeling the burden of his brother's trust settle on his shoulders like stone. "I didn't ask for this," he said finally, his voice rough. "But I reckon neither did you. We'll find a way." And in that moment, though the fire crackled low and the snow pressed heavy against the windows, something unspoken passed between them, not romance, not yet, but the first fragile thread of a bond stitched by duty, loss, and the faintest spark of possibility. She stood still for a long moment, her broad shoulders rising and falling with the weight of her breath, as though waiting for him to take the words back. No one had ever chosen her, men had only ever laughed at her size, called her names behind her back, or dismissed her as too much of everything. His brother, sick and fading, had been the only one to look her in the eye and say, "You're mine." And now, with him gone, the fragile tether that kept her from drifting away had been handed to this man who was staring at her as if he wasn't sure whether to accept the gift or call it a burden. "I can work," she blurted suddenly, her voice louder than she meant, echoing off the cabin walls. "Chop wood, mend fences, tend stock. You won't need to feed me for nothing." Her words were hard, but the plea underneath was raw. He studied her, the firelight throwing shadows across his weathered face. "It ain't about earning your keep," he said quietly. "It's about not letting you be alone." The truth of it stilled her, cutting deeper than any kindness she'd known, and for the first time since she'd stepped into that cabin, her throat tightened with unshed tears. Outside, the storm beat harder against the shutters, but inside, a fragile peace settled. He pulled another chair to the hearth and motioned for her to sit, as if to say this place was hers now, not as a stranger, not as a burden, but as something else, though neither of them yet had the words for it. She lowered herself slowly, her frame dwarfing the chair, and for the first time in days, she let out a breath that wasn't wrapped in fear. The days that followed carried a silence so thick it felt like another presence in the cabin. He was a man of few words, always had been, and she, well, she had learned long ago that her voice, when it drew too much notice, brought only mocking laughter. So they moved around each other carefully, like two strangers bound by a rope neither could untie. In the mornings, she rose before him, her heavy steps shaking the floorboards as she brought in wood for the fire and milked the cow without being asked. At first, she expected him to stop her, to tell her those weren't her tasks. Instead, when he came in and found the hearth already blazing and the milk steaming warm in its pail, he only gave the smallest nod of approval. It was more than she'd ever gotten from most men. One evening, while repairing tack in the barn, he caught sight of her lifting a beam into place. On her own, her strength turning the chore into something effortless. "You'll work yourself to the bone," he said from the shadows, his tone not scolding but cautious. She looked over her shoulder, a flicker of defensiveness in her eyes. "Better to be useful than unwanted." The words hung between them, sharp and aching. He set down the leather strap he was mending and stepped closer, his boots crunching softly over the hay. "I didn't say you're unwanted," he said quietly. "This place, it feels too big for just one. My brother knew that. Maybe he was right, leaving you to me." For a moment, her chest tightened as though she'd been struck, not from pain but from something gentler, something she wasn't used to, the thought of belonging. Still, the outside world crept in. When they made their first trip into town together, the whispers followed like biting flies. Folks stopped what they were doing to watch them, eyes sliding from her towering frame to him, then back again. "That's his brother's widow," one muttered. "No, his wife now." A laugh followed, low and cruel. Her face burned hot, her hands curling into fists, but he reached out and took the heavy sack she was carrying, meeting her eyes with a calm steadiness that steadied her in return. "Let him talk," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear. "They don't know what it is to keep a promise." And in that moment, for the first time, she felt less like a burden and more like a partner. The days after their trip to town left her uneasy. Every whispered laugh seemed to echo louder in her mind, and even in the quiet of the cabin she felt their judgment pressing in. She rose earlier and worked harder, as if by sheer effort she could erase the memory of those looks. She carried buckets of water from the creek, split logs until her arms burned, and scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing. He noticed, though he said little at first, watching her wear herself down like a beast of burden. One evening, when she came in with her palms raw and red from chopping wood, he took the axe from her hands without a word and set it by the wall. "Sit," he said firmly, gesturing to the chair by the fire. She hesitated, unused to being told to rest. But when he fetched a cloth and a tin of salve, kneeling in front of her to tend the angry blisters, she realized his command hadn't been to control her, it had been to care for her. Her eyes stung, and she looked away, unable to stop the tears that slipped free. The following Sunday, he insisted they go back into town. She balked at first, her heart pounding with dread at the thought of the whispers. "We don't need anything," she muttered. But he simply said, "We need to be seen. Together." His tone left no room for argument, and so she went, her stomach in knots as they rode in. Sure enough, the murmurs started again when they walked into the mercantile. She could feel the weight of every gaze, hear the smirks hidden behind cupped hands. Then one man, bolder than the rest, called out, "Careful, fella. Don't let her crush ya in bed." Laughter rippled cruelly through the store. She froze, shame-hot and familiar, ready to shrink back as she always had before. But before she could move, her husband stepped forward. His voice was low, steady, but it carried through the room like the crack of a whip. "You've got a sharp tongue," he said to the man, "but a weak spine, hiding behind others' laughter. Say another word about my wife, and you'll answer to me." The room went quiet, the laughter dying instantly. The man muttered something under his breath and turned away, suddenly busying himself with the goods on the shelf. And just like that, the air shifted. For the first time, she wasn't standing alone against their ridicule, he was beside her, shielding her. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. She walked out of that store with her head a little higher, her heart unsteady but stronger. That night, as the fire crackled low, she whispered into the quiet, "No one's ever stood up for me before." He looked at her, his face softened by the lamplight. "Then they were fools," he said. "Because you're worth standing for." And for the first time in her life, she almost believed it. Weeks rolled by, and the ranch seemed to breathe differently with her in it. She began to hum while cooking, sometimes even laugh when the milk calf tugged too hard at her skirt, though the sound startled her as much as it did him. She grew into the rhythm of the place, feeding the chickens, kneading bread, stitching clothes by lamplight. Yet still, at night, she would sometimes jolt awake, eyes wide, as if hearing echoes of voices long gone, voices that belittled and beat her down. He never pressed her to explain. Instead, he'd rise silently, add another log to the fire, and sit near until she could fall asleep again. It was in that quiet way he kept proving his promise of kindness, not with grand gestures but with constancy. But the peace didn't last untouched. One afternoon, while she gathered herbs near the creek, she saw a rider approaching from the east, the direction of her childhood home, the place she had prayed never to see again. Her breath caught in her throat as the rider dismounted. He was tall, with the same sneer she remembered from years before, the same cousin who had mocked her size and thrown rocks at her when she was younger. Well, he drawled, looking her up and down like she was livestock. "Didn't think anyone'd take you. But I see my uncle was right, you ended up on some man's charity." His words sliced into her, old shame roaring back stronger than ever. She froze, unable to answer, until a shadow fell between them. Her husband had come quietly, but now he stood in front of her, his frame rigid as stone. "You're trespassing," he said flatly. The cousin chuckled, "I'm just saying hello to family." His gaze slid past the rancher, back to her, and it twisted her stomach. "You always were a burden. Guess you still are." But before he could finish, the rancher stepped closer, his voice steady but sharp as a drawn blade. "You'll not speak to her like that. Not here, not anywhere." The air was thick, her heart pounding as the cousin smirked like he'd push further, until he saw the look in the rancher's eyes, a look that promised no bluff. With a muttered curse, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving her trembling. And for the first time, she didn't feel helpless after such words, because she hadn't stood alone. That night she couldn't eat. She sat at the table with her hands in her lap, the stew in her bowl growing cold. Her mind replayed every cruel word from her cousin, every memory of being shoved aside, ridiculed, and reminded she would never be wanted. Finally, she whispered, almost too softly to hear, he was right. I've always been a burden. The rancher, who had been quietly ladling stew into his own bowl, set the spoon down and looked at her. His eyes weren't angry, only steady, almost sorrowful, as if he'd heard this confession before, on the lips of too many who had been beaten down. He leaned forward, elbows braced on the table. You're not a burden, you're my wife. His words were simple, but spoken with such conviction that she found herself trembling. Tears welled up, spilling before she could stop them. You don't know, she choked out, gripping her skirt with trembling fists. You don't know what it was like. Mama worked until her hands bled and still got whipped for not being fast enough. I was mocked for being too big, too slow, too much of everything. They said I'd never be wanted, that I'd be nothing but a mouth to feed. And when my brother was dying, he gave me away because even then, I was just a weight on his chest. Her voice broke, the words tumbling raw, years of hurt she had never spoken aloud before. The rancher stood then, not abruptly, but carefully, circling the table until he stood behind her chair. Without asking, he laid his hand gently on her shoulder, a weight that steadied rather than pressed. You're not too much, he said quietly, the heat of the fire behind him catching in the low timbre of his voice. You're not unwanted, and you'll never be treated like that here. I don't care what they said, you are mine, and I am proud to have you by my side. His hand remained there, firm and unshaking, as she bent her head and wept. For the first time, the tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like the loosening of chains she hadn't realized she still wore. In that moment, she began to believe, just barely, but enough, that perhaps her life could be more than survival. Perhaps she could be loved without condition. The days that followed carried a subtle shift. She still woke early, still worked hard, but there was less desperation in the way she scrubbed or hauled or chopped. Instead of trying to erase herself through labor, she began to notice the small joys woven into the ranch, the way the sunlight stretched gold across the pastures at dawn, the sound of calves bawling for their mothers, even the warmth of bread rising in the oven. She caught herself humming again, this time not to drown out silence, but because something inside her felt lighter. When she carried water from the creek, she no longer tried to match his stride but found her own steady pace, unashamed of the time it took. And each evening when he returned from the fields, her heart lifted at the simple sound of his boots on the porch. It didn't mean the shadows were gone. One afternoon, she stood in front of the mirror, an old one with a crack through the corner, and stared at her reflection. Her broad shoulders, her round face, the way her body filled the frame. For years, she had only seen ridicule staring back, the echo of jeers that told her she was too large, too wrong. But now, when he stepped in behind her and laid his hands gently on her arms, she saw something else reflected, a woman not hidden, not mocked, but claimed. His eyes met hers in the glass. Strong, he murmured, as though it were a blessing. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and for once, she didn't argue. She let the word settle in her chest like an ember taking flame. Then came the day she surprised herself. In town again, she stood beside him at the blacksmith's, waiting for a new hinge, when the same cousin who had once mocked her swaggered past. He smirked, clearly expecting her to drop her gaze, to shrink as she always had. But instead, she lifted her chin, looked him square in the eye, and said evenly, "Keep walking." Her voice didn't tremble, the cousin's smirk faltered, and though he muttered something, he did just as she said. She felt her knees go weak after, but when she looked at her husband, his quiet smile told her everything. She had found her voice, not because he had spoken for her, but because he had given her the safety to speak for herself. And that, more than anything, began to change her life. Spring came with rains that softened the earth, and soon the ranch was alive with green shoots and the cries of newborn calves. She worked alongside him more now, not out of fear of being a burden but because she wanted to share the weight. He taught her to mend a saddle, to drive a fence post, even to aim the old rifle hanging over the hearth. At first, she laughed nervously at the thought of holding such a thing, but his steady hands guided hers, and when she finally hit the tin can they'd set up on the fence, she laughed outright, the sound ringing clear across the pasture. For once, she wasn't clumsy, wasn't too much, she was capable. She began to realize that strength wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a gift she carried, and on the ranch, it was needed. But with the thaw came riders, 2 men with familiar faces she hadn't seen in years. They arrived at dusk, dust on their boots and contempt in their eyes. Her heart sank as she recognized them, cousins from the same family that had taunted her since childhood. The taller one spat into the dirt before speaking. "We heard tell she was here," he said, his eyes cutting to her as though she were property. "She belongs with her kin. We'll be taking her back." The old fear surged inside her, icy and choking, the urge to shrink behind her husband stronger than ever. But he stepped forward, calm as ever, his voice low and unyielding. "She's not leaving," he said. "Not with you, not ever." The cousin sneered, but something in his tone carried steel, and they hesitated. Still, one of them growled, "This ain't over. Blood is blood." That night, she sat by the fire, trembling, tears threatening again. "They'll come back," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "And I don't know if I'm strong enough to face them." Her husband knelt before her, his rough palms covering hers. "You don't have to face them alone," he said. "But hear me, love, you are stronger than they ever let you believe. When they come again, and they will, you'll see it." His words sank deep, though fear still coiled inside her. Yet something else stirred too, something fierce, born of all the nights she had endured and survived. For the first time, she wondered if maybe he was right.